Hello. We come to week 8, which is the book of Nehemiah. And you have a sheet for the book of Nehemiah that I sent you, and two images, both of them purporting to be images of Jerusalem in the time of Nehemiah, as the one which is less colorful but has lots of writing around it makes clear, I think. It's hard for me to say because the writing is so small. Um, these are partly based on the description in Nehemiah and Ezra, and partly, very, very lightly, based on archaeological work, which has been very difficult to perform. Um, but it's impossible to check something like this. So it fits with what we know, and it fits with what most people or conclude is going on, but you can't take any of these things to the bank. If you do have the ESV Study Bible, then after, or in the middle of chapter 3, I think, in the middle of chapter 3 in Nehemiah, you have this 2-page thing, which is the same image as one of the sheets that I sent you. So I did manage to find this. I did manage to find their ESV Study Bible sheet, or um, we've discovered where they got it from. But anyway, one of these images is actually the one that appears on 828 and 829 in the ESV Study Bible, which I think is a very nice rendition of the of what we think is going on with Jerusalem at the time of Nehemiah. And what I like particularly about it is the fact that it makes very clear that the actual area which is being enclosed by the wall, the building of which we're told about in the book of Nehemiah, is clearly a small part of what had been in the city of Jerusalem 3 generations earlier at the beginning of the exile. It's very difficult for us looking back to imagine, after the reconstruction of the city, the people living in the midst of ruins, but that's clearly what they did. The number of people who go back to Jerusalem is a very small part of the number of people who were taken into exile from Jerusalem, or just driven away by it's the Babylonians, I think, who are the second conquerors of the exile. And so we need to keep that in mind. So let's look first at this single sheet of notes that I gave to you, and then we can look at the book again, because it's so short that we can actually do that. I gave you another outline. If there's nothing else, if you learn nothing else from this class, you will at least have learned that I like outlines of biblical books. I don't know what benefit you get from knowing that, but that's, knowledge is good, and that's a fact, which is true. So anyway, this is a very simplified outline, of course. The reason I like it is that it makes clear that there are two general things going on in the book. You get, if you're like me, you get sort of swept up in the particular details of the biblical text as you're reading it, especially if you have one of these 2-volume. Actually, one of the things I like about the ESV Study Bible is it's not two columns on a page. But if you have one of those 2-column Bibles, then that tends to lead me to get more caught up in the details than I would otherwise. And then you can very often miss the big picture. And this outline is good because it does show you that the first part of the book is really about the wall, as far as Nehemiah is concerned. The first part of the book is about the wall, and the second part of the book is about the covenant, getting things going again. So that's useful to have pointed out to us. As far as Matthews and Moyer go, who are the people who take up the rest of the page, they make the point, which I think is important to keep in mind. You will remember, harking back to last week, that Ezra is a not just a priestly figure, as if he were acting it out and not really doing it. Ezra is a descendant of Aaron. He's an actual, real priest. That's his function in the book, and that's why he's chosen to perform that function in the book. He's sent back as a part of this attempt by the central government to reawaken the worship of the Lord in Jerusalem, and we talked some about that last week, how that fits very well with what we know historically and culturally about that period and about that empire, but that it should not be taken by us, and it was not taken by Ezra or the people of his time as being a statement of belief in the Lord along anything like the lines in which the children of Israel believed in the Lord. It's something that those emperors did in order to, consolidate their rule, they hoped, and also manifest their general glory, which is, in Washington, we're very aware of everybody's general glory, including our own, and so we're very sympathetic to people who want to manifest their glory. Okay, it is interesting that Nehemiah is a personal attendant of the king, and that's how this whole sequence begins. That may seem very strange to us. If you remember the Joseph saga in Genesis, keys on that, and that makes sense with what we know how monarchies work. And of course, the same thing is also true in Esther, and the same thing is also true in Daniel, and that historically, as far as I know, in as many different places as I know some history about, that seems to be the way it works when there's one person in charge. First thing you want to be is hanging around that person. So that, as far as that goes, no Babylonian records have been discovered that talk about Nehemiah being sent back, but that no Babylonian records have been discovered that talk about anybody else being sent back instead. We just don't have that kind of information about the ancient world. Does it make sense that this is the kind of thing that might happen? Yes. Kings of great countries liked to keep conquered peoples around as a way to manifest their glory, right? And remind themselves of their own glory in case other people stopped telling them for a moment, oh, you're glorious, or you're glorious. They could look around the room and see all of these conquered kings eating at their table and stuff. We know that Jewish kings were taken off to eat at the table of the monarchs who conquered them. And they could look around the table and think to themselves, behold my glory, I am so wonderful, look at all these people I've conquered. That's what kings like to do. Though apparently not the king of Thailand, which is why they're so sad that he's dead after 70 years. He seems to have been, according to Christian lights, though he was a Buddhist, according to Christian lights, he seems to have been a better kind of king than that. But anyway, Matthews and Moyer argue that what's really going on, as soon as the wall begins to be rebuilt, there's resistance from the officials of the empire who are in the area, and they try to turn Nehemiah and the people rebuilding the wall in and get them in trouble with the powers that be. And this is, of course, advertised by them as concern for the empire and concern that Jerusalem will turn into a focal point of resistance to the central power. But what Matthews and Moyer suggest is really going on is that if Jerusalem is allowed to become a functioning walled city, that it would then appear to the powers that be as an appropriate place to be the center of a new province, a new subunit of the empire. And of course, the local officials of the empire don't want new subunits because that would mean part of the territory they rule being taken away from them and given to someone else. So that this is kind of a career protection move. That certainly makes a lot of sense. Whether or not it's correct is, again, something that we cannot know because we don't have that kind of information. But it's really something worth thinking about. The chance that Nehemiah and those other people had any idea in mind of trying to go back home and break away from the empire seems impossible, because breaking away from the empire by a group that small seems impossible. There are parts of the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, where it might have been possible for little people to splinter off and not be noticed. But for the Persian Empire, Palestine is a border area with the power of Egypt on the other side. So that's not an area that the country is going to ignore. For example, if you were trying to break away from Russia now, if you were over on the border of Mongolia, or what people used to call Outer Mongolia, right, because it's farther away from Peking. If you're over on the border of Mongolia, you're much more likely to succeed in breaking away because the territory you're taking isn't worth much, and Mongolia is not poised to go charging into Siberia and start messing it up. If you were trying to break away somewhere in the vicinity of the Black Sea near Ukraine, where it's perfectly clear that Russia's moving into Ukraine again and thinking seriously about maybe being willing to fight a war to do that, then there would be no chance of your escaping their notice for a second. And the area, Palestine, where Egypt and the Central Power in the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent Power, which at this point is Persia, right, bump up against each other, is exactly the flashpoint that everybody's paying a lot of attention to. So there's no chance at all of these Jews going back and breaking away. That's just not possible. And so it doesn't make any sense that that's a reality. And so it doesn't make any sense to think that Sanballat, the Samaritan governor, catches them doing something. This seems to be, the argument that there's something internal to the empire going on is, on the face of it, a very convincing one. So whether that's exactly what's going on or not, I don't know, but it seems like a very likely thing. Another thing that I wanted to point out to you is this section at the bottom of the page of notes of the bullet points. These different elements are all elements that go together very clearly with the project of reawakening the covenant, the prohibition of interest in loans. If you've read the Exodus law and the Deuteronomy law, you know that the charging of interest is one of the things that you're not supposed to do. And the requirement of people to live in Jerusalem, of course, makes sense because it requires a relatively large number of people to physically support by their labor the worship of the Lord in the temple. And if Jerusalem's really an empty place, you can't go and reawaken the temple with 15 people. It's not enough people to operate the temple. Operating the temple itself with the large scale of sacrifices and lots of different complicated things going on requires a pretty sophisticated and trained large group of people. This is why they're priests and Levites and different kinds of priests and different kinds of Levites, and they're trained in their special things. And when you get to the New Testament and you get John the Baptist's father, who's there serving in the temple, he's got a particular task. I can't remember what. I think he does something with the incense, if they mention it in passing. But anyway, he's got a particular task in the temple, and he's up there for a month, and then his time is up, and he goes home. That's a fully developed and operating temple system, and that requires a relatively large group of people. So they have this lottery, assigning people to live in Jerusalem. One of the things that tells us is that at this point, people going back to the land don't want to live in Jerusalem. Right? Jerusalem's in quite a dry place. There are some springs there, which is why it's possible to live in Jerusalem. But, it's not lush. Even in Middle Eastern terms, it's not lush. And if you were going to make your living with agriculture, which essentially everybody is, Jerusalem's not going to be where you want to be. You want to be somewhere else, a little bit north and west, where the land is flatter and you can plant stuff. There are no, for example, for modern reference, if you think of the kibbutzes, running farms and stuff, there are no kibbutzes near Jerusalem because you can't grow anything. The kibbutzes are in the north, in the plain, on the western side of the Jordan. Okay, so the rest of these things also go along with that. The prohibition of business on the Sabbath, the dissolution of mixed marriages, with which the book ends, the appointment of temple officials, the treasurers. All of that stuff goes together with reawakening the functioning of the covenant. And I wanted to include their final thing there, which makes a mention of Psalm 78 as the kind of psalm that would go along with what's going on in chapter 9 in the book. Psalm 78, which is a long one, 72 verses, so I won't read it to you because we don't have enough time. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders he has done. He established a testimony, and Jacob appointed a law in Israel. This is the kind of thing you sing when you're renewing the covenant. You talk about the Lord and how he's taken care of Israel and how he's appointed a covenant. So now we've got to shape up and live up to the covenant, right? I included that because it's a useful Bible study tip to have that in mind, but also because it's always good to be reminded that the book of Psalms that we think of as a separate thing, because for us in our book it's a separate thing, is actually something that reflects the breadth of the life of Israel and comes from different parts of that life. We historical books of the Old Testament readers have been reminded of that because we've seen a number of Psalms go by in the books that we've read. But more than just the ones that have been copied into the books actually belong in situations like those we've seen. So I thought that would be a useful thing to remind you of. Okay, well that's 15 minutes. Why don't we take a look at the book now? I just as a note, I discovered on the internet that there are publications you can get that have a series of images or models, pictures of models of Jerusalem as it is thought to have looked at different stages in its development. That's what this other colorful one, Carta Jerusalem, comes from, a publication like that. I looked on Amazon. American Amazon doesn't have any of these things to sell you as far as I was able to discover. They seem to be printed in Israel and I assume sold to tourists. So I'm sure you could find them on those little, postcard racks if you were in Jerusalem in the right place. I don't have one of those things. I wish I did now. But they do exist, just sort of reminding you. It may be that people who know their way around the internet better than I do could find them. And they might be very useful things to pass around at a Bible study or to have with you as you study the Bible. If you have an ESV study Bible, as I do and as we suggest that you do, then of course you have very good images in there. And I've said more than once that I think these sort of map and reconstruction things, the kind of things that we used to see in National Geographic when I was growing up, when they would still do a lot of stuff on archaeology and the Bible. I don't know what they do now. I don't get National Geographic anymore. But those kinds of images are very useful to have. Okay, so we'll just begin at the beginning of the book and go through and see what we can see. A quick note on verse 1. It happened in the month of Chislev. One of the things that modern scholars have discovered is, first of all, that the calendar of months that the Jews used changed over time. At different times in the history of Judaism, they have used different names of months. Now, of course, you may know, if from studying the early history of the church, that In the period of the early church, the month of Nisan is when Passover comes, and Jesus is crucified on the 14th of Nisan. Or really, the Easter is the 14th of Nisan, the original Easter. And there's a fight in the early church about whether they should always do Easter on that day or whether they should do it on the Sunday nearest. And that goes on for a number of centuries. Nisan is a month that the Jews are using at that time. They actually still use the same months as they did then, but they did not always use those months. And the reason I bring this up is that none of these calendars of months are Jewish. They are all of these calendars are borrowed by the Jews from other people among whom they live. So people often refer to the Jewish months for things because Jews actively still use a calendar which is different from other people. But you should know that there's no such thing as, strictly speaking, there's no such thing as a Jewish calendar because their calendar, even their traditional one, is borrowed. In the same way that if you study the history of liturgy, you should know that there is no such thing as a Roman Latin Mass. The Latin Mass is Spanish. That is the traditional Roman Mass is Spanish. So it's important to know that kind of thing because it helps you understand what it is you're really looking at. So here in the month of Chislev, this is according to the months that they're using at this time, but it's not a native Jewish system. Okay. The book is cast in the first person generally, the words of Nehemiah. We saw that Ezra was part third person, part first person, but began in the third person, and then ends in the first. Nehemiah begins in the first person. Okay. That one of his brothers is visiting from Judah, so at least at that point, not all of his family was even in exile. Some of them had gone back or maybe had never left. And there's concern about what's going on in Israel. First thing that shows us is that the Jewish community in exile has contact with the surviving Jewish community in Palestine. The exile is not a complete cutting off. It's a transportation, but it does not mean that they leave everything behind. And also, something important to know, not only the Babylonians transported groups of people, this transportation of groups of people from one place to another was a relatively common thing in ancient Middle Eastern kingdoms and empires, and as a matter of fact, it continues up to the present day. They still do this kind of thing. They move people around for policing purposes and for occupying of territories purposes and things. So that this is a historically known technique of management of your population. So I heard once in a Bible study someone complaining about the Bible being clearly non-historical because that kind of stuff never happened, and that's just not accurate. That kind of stuff, as a matter of fact, happens now, but I won't give you historical examples, but we know that this happened repeatedly in the ancient period, and so it's not surprising that in that case that inside a large empire, people who are from Palestine would still have an interest in and contact with Palestine itself because they were interested in knowing what went on. And in these big empires, people traveled around, officials, but also merchants and other people traveled around as part of their, the normal patterns of their lives. And we see this in Tobit and other biblical books, and it's perfectly historical. So, okay, they're worried because the wall of Jerusalem is burned down and it's kind of a shell. Okay, so he's sad here in verse 4, and he says a prayer. recognizing that all of this comes from the sinfulness of the people. That's what's really going on. And saying, it's what we should have expected, because, of course, Moses here in verse 8 was, warning them that if they were unfaithful, this will happen. And then they were unfaithful, and it happened. So it's not only a prayer of anguish, but it's a sort of confession to God that this is just treatment for the children of Israel, and he's the cupbearer to the king. So in the month of Nisan, this is the spring month, when Passover comes, our King Artaxerxes is there, and he is waiting on King Artaxerxes. This is the period of the Persian Wars, right, for those of you who do ancient history. So it's Xerxes and Artaxerxes. And the king notices that he looks different because the king sees him every day when he brings him wine. And so they have this conversation, and he is emboldened to request to be sent to rebuild his homeland in verse 7 of chapter 2. And the king, wants to know how that's going to work, and gives his permission. So Nehemiah goes in verse 9 of chapter 2 and takes his letters of permission and letters of support and hands them to the governors of the province beyond the river, capitalized in verse 9 in the ESV of chapter 2. And the beyond the river is what the Middle Eastern empires called Palestine. I think probably the province is actually everything past the Tigris, which is the westernmost of the two big rivers, the Tigris and then the Euphrates. I think it's everything past the Tigris. So I think the river is the Tigris, not the Jordan, which is not all that much worth noticing if you're the emperor of a huge territory. But anyway, so in other words, that's why there are multiple governors. It's quite a large area. It's the western border area in the south. Okay, so he has people accompanying him, and then these local guys, Tobiah the Ammonite and Sanballat the Horonite, are not glad that the Jews are coming back, they being from among the other peoples who live in that part of the empire. And so, they receive the word, but they don't like it. And then he goes to Jerusalem in verse 11. And then I have to say, this night inspection tour of Nehemiah, which is recounted here starting in verse 11, is, to my mind, one of the great passages in Scripture. It's 42 years. Oh, gee, that's too. Maybe it'll fade on us. There, that's better. It's 42 years since I've been in Jerusalem this fall. But I remember very vividly, of course, what it looked like. And this going out around the gates and looking at the walls, the first person account. He goes out at night so he can move around and see the structures without any people in the way. From the first time I read this, I found this very moving, and it has always struck me as being a real account of a real occasion by a real person. And which is why I wanted you to have these images of what Jerusalem may well have looked like. It's quite a small area. It would have been possible for him to walk his horse around it, in taking not very long to do so. The hills are quite steep, so if he's in the Kidron Valley, which is to the lower right of these images, along down by the stream there, looking up at the walls. He would have been able to do that quite quickly. I was a 16-year-old kid with lots of energy, even though it was August and hot as blazes. I walked around Jerusalem a number of times in the days that I was there, and around the old part, around the wall part, which is much larger now than it was then. And you can do it. It's not, and it's by no means an insurmountable task. And so this is very interesting because he's able to see the great difficulties. Jerusalem is not, even in terms of the empire at the time, Jerusalem is pretty much a border town, and the next thing south, you get sort of more and more desert, and then you get Egypt, and you can't get any reasonable kind of population to live in a place like Jerusalem without walls to protect them, even just from bandits wandering around in the desert, let alone armies of neighboring states. So the need to build walls for Jerusalem is real. If you're going to take back the temple furniture as much as survives, and bring in lots of livestock for the sacrifices, all that kind of stuff, then you're going to be putting in Jerusalem valuable things that are very portable, and that's exactly the kind of stuff that will attract bandits and soldiers from other countries. And so you can't, last time we looked at Ezra, who's focused all on the temple, and it is certainly possible to get the temple going without doing anything about the city. You can do that if you want to, but I do not think the temple will long survive because it will be such an attractive target for people who are up to no good. So I do not think that that is necessarily an argument that Nehemiah historically needs to come first. But certainly you can see that if Ezra's already done his work and the temple's already functioning, Nehemiah would feel a special need to protect the temple with a wall. If Nehemiah is just trying to rebuild Jerusalem so that it can be the beginning of functioning covenant life, which is clearly what he's interested in, that's what his prayer was about, then you can see that he would want to do that first before he put the temple in there. It's certainly, the solution to the Ezra-Nehemiah problem may be something as obvious as the fact that people argue dates about these, and some have Ezra 100 years before Nehemiah. It's certainly possible. It's also possible, of course, that they overlap in time. We just don't know. But anyway, they're coming at things from different points of view, which is of course why it's made sense that Scripture contains both books, because they do certainly complement each other, but they are not recountings of the same thing. They're recounting of different aspects of the same larger process. So for people like us who are interested in what they're doing, both of these things are worth having because they're really quite different. Okay, so he goes through, he goes around and takes a look, and then and then he sort of announces what needs to be done. So then you get the interesting sort of cooperative process by which the wall gets rebuilt here in chapter 3, and the telling of the tale of who did what and where. Just as a quick note, look at verse 6. Joiada the son of Paseah and Meshullam the son of Besodeah repaired the gate of Yeshana. They laid its beams and set its doors, its bolts, and its bars. They just are making the point, first of all, the gate is a big structure, that also had rooms inside it and everything. If you do Old Testament, you realize the gates are, they're multiple layers, and it's quite a complicated structure. They're making the point that they're rebuilding the stone stuff, but they're also setting up inside it the gates that actually open and close. That's the beams, doors, bolts, and bars. In other words, not only do they build the kind of castle part, but they make it possible to close the gates. And that's an important thing. They're making that point because they're trying to say that, when they've done this, going all the way around, they can shut the gates and be inside and have whoever it is they want to keep outside outside. If you just build the walls and don't have the gates, anybody can walk right in. If you build the walls and the gates, but you don't have the doors, you still can't close them. You can stand up above and, throw down rocks and stuff, but you can't shut people out. So that's why those things are mentioned, because there were places, we know, in these empires, there were some places where the emperor, the king, to punish a town, would take away its, what we would call the gates, take away the door parts, right? So they wouldn't be able to close themselves off, and it would mean that they were more at risk. They would need the king's army to protect them more than they would otherwise. And so the king would take away their doors and, teach them who's really keeping them safe, and hope that that would shut them up and make them more obedient subjects. So these things are, they're getting everything done. Okay, so it counts all the way around, and that's chapter 3, which is a very interesting thing. And of course, clearly, chapter 3 is the basis in these images. In the one from the ESV, the names of all the gates and towers and stuff, which are the sort of signposts of the progress around. Though that's all, those names and things are coming from the text. These things, these items themselves have not been discovered, as far as I know, and certainly the names of them have not been discovered archaeologically. So this reconstruction on the page that I sent you, the one that says Colic Files WordPress.com at the bottom, which is the ESV one, the writing on the page comes from the text. And the idea of where the things belong comes partly from the text and partly from the little bit that's been discovered on the ground, which isn't very much. Okay, so here we get Sanballat, whom we heard about before at the beginning of chapter 4, and he's angry that he and his buddies in Samaria, which is, the little bit northern part, which is richer in the location of the northern kingdom, the Samaritans, the people from Samaria, the people who'd been moved into that area by the Babylonians to farm it when the Jews were gone. Those people are hostile to all of this, and are talking about how they want to do something about it. So they plot here in verse 8 of chapter 4 to come and stop the work, right? And so this is when Nehemiah stations guards so that the work can go forward with people standing by. Half of them here in verse 16 in chapter 4, he mentions half of them are armed and half are working. A very interesting picture. Just as a note, the Persian Empire was very highly organized. It is Herodotus, when he's talking about the messengers who neither frost nor rain nor snow will keep them from their daily course, which is sort of the motto of the American Postal Service. That comes from Herodotus's description of the internal communications run by the Persian Empire. Right? They had a good and well-developed bureaucracy, but Jerusalem's a long way from Susa, the capital of the empire. So there can be this kind of squabbling. And I call it squabbling because we'll see at the end of the book that the number of people involved is really very small. Right? Okay. So Nehemiah, as a part of this, Nehemiah is worried about how the people are getting along. So here at the beginning of 5, there arose a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers. There were those who said, with our wives, sons and our daughters, we are many, let us get grain so we may eat and keep alive. And there were also those who said, we're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses to get grain. They're having trouble making it, and he's very angry at the local people who are important. This is about the exacting of interest, each from his brother, which you're not supposed to do, right? I held a great assembly against them, verse 7, chapter 5, and said to them, as far as we are able, we've brought back these people from exile, and now you're going to put them into debt slavery. Here, verse 9 and chapter 5, ought you not to walk in the fear of God to prevent the taunts of the nations, our enemies? So, abandon the exacting of interest. He's trying to call them back to good behavior for religious and practical reasons, both. Okay. So, he seems to be the governor of this reclamation operation here. I'm looking at verse 14 in chapter 5, up for 12 years, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king. They did not actually take the food allowance that was due to the governor. The governors who had been before him had done that, whether these are Jewish governors, and Ezra was earlier, and there was this is partway through the rebuilding the Jewish kingdom project, or whether these were Horonites and Ammonites who were local governors. We don't know. But anyway, Nehemiah makes a point of the fact that he's feeding out of his own pocket 150 men in verse 16, rather than drawing on the population to support him. And this clearly in the context is done for religious motives, because the taking advantage of people in a difficult situation is clearly not allowed by the law. So he's trying to be a good covenant Jew. Okay. So chapter 6, you get these other important people around. Sanballat and Tobiah we've heard of. Geshem the Arab would have been a chieftain of local nomads. Arab means wanderer or nomad, and so strictly speaking, Arabs are people who wander around and live in tents. They don't live in buildings. When I was studying Arabic with the Peace Corps, we had these little dialogues we would memorize to help us pronounce things and stuff. And the first one of them was, where does a man live? A man lives in a tent. Where does a Frenchman, a Frank, live, which is the usual Arabic word for Westerner? A Frank lives in a house, but a man lives in a tent. And I thought, well, this is real stuff. Not all Arabs live in tents, but logically, I guess they should. Okay. So he is trying to get along with Sanballat and Geshem and Tobiah. They're inviting him to a parley in verse 2 of chapter 6, but he's seen enough westerns to know that you don't go out of your safe place to where the bandits are, so they'll lie in wait for you. They sent to him 4 times this way, and I said, I think really I don't want to do that. So then in verse 5 of chapter 6, the 5th time he sends his servant to me with an open letter in his hand, and then we get the letter, trying to put themselves, forward for, come and let us take counsel together. So, but he thinks that it's all a put up job. Okay. Anyway, the wall is finished in verse 15 of chapter 6. 52 days, pretty quick. Um, how can they do it so quickly? Just as a note, if you look at the image from the ESV, one of the things it ought to remind you of is the fact that the ruined city lies all around them, right? And first of all, the city had also had larger walls than they are rebuilding. So when they rebuild the walls, what are they doing? They're not cutting any stone. They're just taking stone from the ruins, most likely the ruins of the walls, and transporting it to where they want the new walls to be. So if you've ever built something out of Lincoln logs, and if you've ever started with a big piece of wood and tried to whittle something, you know that starting with the raw material, the big piece of wood, is a lot slower than starting with Lincoln logs. They're rebuilding these walls in a Lincoln log or Lego type situation. They're just putting them together, and that's why it's so quick. They may have to put them together with mortar, though most defensive walls were not built that way. In ancient times, they were just piles of big rocks. They may just have to pile them up on top of each other, and they would already be cut into the right useful shapes. So it would really be a construction in the sense of putting together job rather than a creation job. Okay. So the wall is built, and he sets up a system, gatekeepers for the doors and singers and Levites. He's getting everybody ready to function. Hanani and Hananiah are going to be in charge of Jerusalem. And then you get the lists of people, right? God put into my heart to assemble the nobles and the officials and the people to be enrolled by genealogy. And I found the book of the genealogy of those who came up at the first, and I found written in it, and here you get, now, the Old Testament is full of genealogies and lists of people, right? Like numbers. The Babylonian Empire and then the Persians after them had these highly developed bureaucracies, and they very likely kept track of who it was they were moving and where they were moving them to. And so when people were sent back, it is certainly not unreasonable to think that there were lists that were sent along with them. These are the people who are allowed to go, with some idea of how many people exactly were involved. As always in the Bible, these lists are usually of heads of families. They're usually the fathers of families are listed, and they're identified by their patrilineal history. And so which is why, of course, you get a list. You get a list that has names and then numbers, because the names are not going to automatically tell you the numbers, even if you count all the way down to individual families, because families can have widely different numbers in them, right? So some of these clearly seem to be clans, right? If you look here, beginning in verse 8 of chapter 7, sons of Parosh, 2,172, sons of Shephatiah, 372, sons of Arah, 652, sons of Pahath Moab, namely the sons of Jeshua and Joab, 2818, and so forth. If you look at all of these are actually quite small numbers of people. Now, you have look at how this works, right? The number of the men of the people of Israel, that's verse 7 in chapter 7. Then you get this list. Then you get priests, beginning in chapter 39, right? Then you get Levites, beginning in 43. Not all that many, 74 and 148 and 138, right? That's not a lot of Levites. Then you get temple servants, and they're counted up. You notice by the time you get to temple servants, you're not getting numbers anymore. They don't know that. They don't have that kind of level of detail. Sons of Solomon's servants. That's interesting. Those would have been people from the old bureaucracy, the civil running of the kingdom. Notice that it goes back to Solomon. I think we saw this last week. It goes back to Solomon because Solomon, of course, is the last king of the United Kingdom back before everything began to fall apart. So they still think of them as Solomon's servants, the servants of the whole kingdom. Okay, and then you get these people who are sort of tagging along at the end. Verse 61, the following were those who came up from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cheruv, Adon, and Immer, but they couldn't prove their descent. And so they claim Levitical status, but they're not granted recognition because they can't prove their lineage, which is interesting. We don't know exactly how you would have proven your lineage, but the fact that there is a way to prove it and these people can't do it shows that there is some kind of knowledge involved. There's some kind of judgment behind these numbers, okay, which is interesting to know. So then you get, first of all, the reason, what I'm trying to point out to you is Nehemiah is trying to reconstruct Israelite society. In order to do that, you need the people of Israel. You need the people, right? You need priests. You need Levites. You need temple servants who perform different functions, right? And then you need civil servants to run the practicalities of the kingdom. All of those people are counted separately because all of these people are needed separately. No matter how many people of Israel you have, you can't run the temple if you don't have any priests, right? And no matter how many priests you have, you can't run the kingdom if you don't have someone who knows how to run the kingdom. So you've got to have, descendants of the servants of Solomon. There's an underlying understanding of what it takes to reawaken the Israelite way of life, which is a communal thing. It requires all these different groups of people cooperating. And that lies behind what Nehemiah is trying to do. This, logically, is why the Jews kept track of who all these people were. Up to the present day, if you go to a synagogue, there is a time in the service when the priests, the descendants of Aaron, stand up and offer a priestly blessing to the congregation. That's why the only real Jewish names there are Cohen, and God, which means priest, right? Or Levi, because they need to know who the priests and the Levites are, because still now in the synagogue period they have certain things they do that other people don't do. And if the Messiah comes, they're the one they're waiting for, they missed him, right? But when if the temple gets set up again, they need to know who these people are in order to be able for the temple to function, right? It's very, from a Christian standpoint, seems very odd that, we know that, we know this comes right out of the Old Testament, but it seems very odd, and I have been in synagogues, for people's bar mitzvahs and stuff like that, and this bunch of people stand up who know way less than the rabbi, and but of course it's a different thing, right? And they offer this blessing in the middle of the service, which they have an ancestral right and responsibility to do. It's a very interesting thing to see. It makes me think about how Judaism actually worked, in the biblical period and at the time of our Lord. Okay, so he's got everybody, he's counting up everybody and getting them organized. What does he do next? Well, he's got the structure, right? And so the next thing he needs, as we saw in our outline, is the covenant, needs the law. So, chapter 8, All the people gathered as one man into the square before the water gate. They told Ezra the scribe, now we're in third person, right? To bring the books of the law of Moses that the Lord had commanded Israel. So he brings them out before the assembly. It says he's a priest, right? Ezra the priest. And Ezra the scribe and Ezra the priest. And he read from it from early morning till midday, verse 3, in the presence of the men and the women and those who could understand. Um, Whether this is understanding language or people who are old enough to understand and not too old, um, is not completely clear. But they're all listening. They have a platform stood up for him to read from so people can see, and also of course they can see the book, right? Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, verse 5, for he was above all the people, and when he opened it up they all stood up as a sign of respect, and he blessed the Lord, hallelujah, right? Praise the Lord. And the people all said amen, amen, lifting up their hands in prayer. And okay, so then you get Nehemiah and Ezra. Here they are together. It's not completely clear that this Ezra is the Ezra of the last book. That's one of the things people wonder about and fight about. And the reason why they fight about it is because we don't know. Anyway, and they do Sukkoth, beginning in chapter 13, the Feast of the Booths, Harvest Festival, right? And in chapter 9, you get worship. On the 24th day of this month, the people of Israel were assembled with fasting and sackcloth and earth on their heads, like Job, right? Mourning for their sins. The Israelites separate themselves from all foreigners, confess their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. They stood up in their place. They read from the law for a quarter of the day. For a quarter of the day, they confess and worship the Lord. There's everybody standing there. They pray and they recount, as Jews like to do when they pray, the history, the salvation history of the Old Testament. You saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt, verse 9, right? But then they didn't do the right thing. Verse 16, they and our fathers acted presumptuously and stiffened their neck and didn't obey your commandments. Verse 22, you gave them kingdoms and peoples, and so you were blessing them. Nevertheless, verse 26, they were disobedient, rebelled against you, and cast your law behind their back and killed your prophets. A number of psalms do this recounting of the salvation history of the continual misbehavior of the Jews and the continual forgiveness and seeking of them by the Lord. And then so they go through all of this, and then they say, they want to renew the covenant, 38. Because of all this, we make a firm covenant in writing. On the sealed documents are the names of our princes, Levites, and priests. Interesting. The princes represent the people, and the Levites and priests. And then you get names, right? And then you get what the covenant really involves. Beginning in verse 28 of chapter 10, the rest of the people. And notice how they're counted off according to their functional groups, for what they need to do. Priests, Levites, gatekeepers, singers, temple servants, right? They're all swearing to obey the commandment. And they, in verse 32, take on themselves the obligation to support the temple with their temple tax, which we see Jesus and Peter doing in the Gospels, right? When, if you're reading through the Bible in the air, I think it was yesterday, that was one of the times when Jesus had Peter catch a fish that had a shekel in it, or maybe a denarius, I can't remember. Anyway, which was enough for both of their taxes for the year. Okay. So they're promising to do that. In other words, they're promising to do the things that are necessary to have the Israelite nation function as a group of people in a covenant relationship with the Lord, performing the necessary rites and worship. That's what they're promising. Okay. Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, chapter 11. because that's going to be the seat of the government and also, of course, where the temple is. And the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city. 9 out of 10 remained in the other towns. We already talked about that. And so you got lists of the chiefs of the province, and then in verse 10 the priests, and in 15 the Levites, and 19 the gatekeepers, and then the villages round about begin to be recounted at, starting in verse 25 of 11, and you get more listing of priests and Levites in 12. All of this is making very clear how this is going to be structured and who the people are, partly as a record of the fact that this is being done appropriately, and partly to give credit to the people who were willing to come back from exile and willing to go through the difficulties and dangers necessary to do this. Okay, so they're setting up the dedication and the worship, and it's interesting that there are 2 choirs of singers here, in beginning in verse 31, and then 38 is the other one. And the final step is chapter 13. They read from the book of the Moses in the hearing of the people. This is the separation of the people from each other. And it ends with the putting away of the foreign wives and children, which is necessary, ritually necessary for cleanliness. On a human level, it's a difficult thing, certainly for us, since I have no responsibility to fulfill the law of, the covenant that way. It's very easy for me to downgrade the value of keeping the covenant because it's not something that I do, and to be horrified at the putting away of the wives and children. But at that time, in that place, this is clearly because they had jumped into the midst of the surrounding people and enmeshed themselves with them in order for them to begin a life as a people who can actually function in ritually clean ways. They have to separate themselves out. There is no other way to do this. So I think the only way to understand this is that it's a necessary step to get to where they should always have been. And so it's a case that the foreign wives and the half-foreign children are victims of the previous sinfulness of the Israelite man. I still think it's a terrible thing to do, but it's sort of built into the way the system works. It's an interesting thing to wonder whether or not it would have been possible for the wives and children to convert. It always was possible, as far as I know, for non-Jewish people to convert and join into the community. Maybe it's just too many of them, and it was, practically impossible. I don't know. It's a somber note to end on. The last line, "Remember me, O my God, for good," can either be taken as Nehemiah being tremendously pleased that he got all these people thrown out. So, look at me, wow, didn't I do something great? Or a kind of plea recognizing that this was a dreadful thing to do. Please remember me, O Lord, for the good I did and not this essentially cruel process. And as you can imagine, people have argued it in both ways all the way through the history of interpretation of the book. It's one of those puzzles with which the Scripture confronts us. So thank you. Next week we will start on Chronicles. We have 2 weeks on Chronicles and then we're done. It's going very quickly. Thank you for your patience.